It's good to be with you all this morning. Thank you all for being here. If you'd like to, you can open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. I'm going to have almost the entirety of our text up on the PowerPoint if you'd like to follow along with me there, but also I welcome you to open your Bible as well so you can read along. After services last Sunday, Luke Mallour came up to me and he said, "What are you preaching on next week?" And I said, "Well, I haven't decided yet. What do you think I should preach on?" And he thought for a while and he said, "David and Goliath." So we're going to study from David and Goliath this morning. It's a wonderful story. It's one that even if we've heard it 100 times, I think that there is always something more that we can gain from this story. It's so central to the unfolding of God's scheme of redemption as God is revealing to us the manner in which He saves and as He's preparing us for David's future descendant, the Messiah who was to come. But this morning I just want us to follow this story and we're going to make some observations as we go through it, but we'll save really the main point for last. But we're going to just go through this story and we're going to kind of break it up into a few sections and follow the plot as it unfolds. And as we open to 1 Samuel 17, we are seeing a dilemma. The Israelites they're having to go up against the Philistines because the Philistines have invaded their territory. They've always kind of been a problem during Saul's when Saul was reigning over Israel, but at this point they have invaded even further into Israel than usual. They are only 12 miles away from Bethlehem, and so the Israelites have gone to try to fend them off and to try to defend their territory. The problem, though, is that they have sort of become gridlocked on these two different mountains. It says in verse 3 that the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. And at first that doesn't seem very significant. It sounds like he's just giving us sort of the layout of the landscape of where this battle was going to take place. But the valley that was between them, the valley of Elah, is significant because in that valley there was this great ravine or gulf where basically for one army to advance against the other army, for them to come off of their mountain and to advance across that valley, they would have to go into that ravine, and that would essentially guarantee that they were going to be conquered. They would be fighting uphill, the defending army would be fighting downhill, and so basically the Israelites and the Philistines are at a stalemate. If either one of them advance, the other one is going to have the upper hand. So they're on these two mountains. They're pretty much stuck there. They're not really fighting with each other. They're sort of just waiting for the other army to make a move. And it's in the middle of this stalemate, this sort of impasse, that a certain man steps forward. In verse 4 it says that there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, word champion, when we think of champion, we think of somebody who wins a game. We think of, the Super Bowl champions are the ones who win the Super Bowl. But a champion in this context means something a little bit different. It's not so much a winner as it is a man who was set apart from the rest of the army. The word that is translated here as champion is a Hebrew phrase that literally means a man between two camps, or alternately, a man of the space between. So a champion then was somebody who came from one army to fight a champion in the other army as a representative for his army. So Goliath was the champion of the Philistines. He was the one that they had selected. He was their first pick who was going to go and fight against Israel's first pick. And the reason that this was even necessary, again, is because they're at a stalemate. Nobody's advancing against the other one. And so Goliath comes out and he's like, let's settle this through championship warfare. And this was something that in ancient combat was relatively common whenever maybe they wanted to avoid bloodshed of an all-out war. They would just have two men from each side get into a sort of duel, a one-on-one combat with each other. And the outcome of the battle was determined based upon which champion won. And so that makes a lot of sense whenever we read Goliath's challenge, because essentially what he is issuing is a challenge to champion warfare, rather. He says in verses 5 through 7, that's description of his armor. In verses 8 through 10, it says, "He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together.'" So this is Goliath's challenge. He's essentially saying, we have our champion, you pick your champion, and let's settle this. We don't know how long they have been here. We don't know how long they've been camped out on these mountains. But obviously, he's tired of waiting. He's ready for there to be some sort of resolution to this conflict. And so he issues this challenge, and the Israelites simply need to send forth a man who will meet him on these terms. The problem is that nobody wants to do it. It says in verse 11, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." So nobody's lining up to fight Goliath. Nobody's raising their hand on Israel's mountain saying, "I'll do it." Not even Saul. And the reason that Saul is mentioned specifically is because if you're following the narrative of 1 Samuel, you're expecting Saul to be the one who steps up to fight. Because Saul was the people's champion of Israel. He was the one who the people had, when they had asked for a king, Saul was the perfect sort of, he was what you imagined when you imagined a king. He was the tallest man in Israel. He was a fearless conqueror. But up until this point, he has been fighting the Philistines valiantly. He's been having success after success. And so everyone's expecting Saul to step forward and to fight Goliath. However, in this critical moment, Saul folds. Saul, along with his fellow soldiers, is dismayed and greatly afraid. And he's not just, this isn't just a momentary lapse of bravery. It's not just like Saul just for a few moments was afraid. This went on for 40 days. For over 6 weeks, Goliath comes out day after day and he issues this challenge. And nobody does anything, not even Saul. And Saul is not even picking somebody to go and fight against Goliath. They're essentially just stuck in this standstill, this stalemate. And Goliath is pointing out the fact that every day that passes, he is essentially defying Israel. He's embarrassing them because they don't have a man. They don't have a man who's brave enough to meet him on these terms. Even their king had been handicapped by this dilemma. And so as we look at this first section, what we're seeing is what happens to a man when his relationship with God has been compromised. Saul, before this point, was actually a very promising young man. Whenever he started out as a king, he was full of promise and potential, and everything looked like it was going to be, just this upward trajectory for him. However, he over and over again disappointed God. He was either disobedient or he was only partially disobedient. He compromised, he made excuses, and he failed to take accountability. And because of that, Saul had been severed from God and ultimately rejected as king. In a few chapters prior, this is actually chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. Samuel tells Saul, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." That is 1 Samuel 15:23. And so Saul, in this critical moment, had been stripped of his confidence. Not because anything had changed in his skill necessarily. Saul was a seasoned warrior. The only thing that had changed was he was no longer right with God. And because of that, his confidence, his bravado, all of that was gone. And that's what happens whenever that life source of our strength has been severed. Whenever our relationship with God has been compromised by disobedience, it is going to catch up to us. And in these critical moments, whenever we need it most, we are going to be bereft of our strength. And so Saul shows us what it's like to be on the other side of the proverb in Proverbs 28:1, which says, "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion." Saul used to be the righteous man who was as bold as a lion, and we see a lot of his success in the prior chapters. But here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we see him as the coward. So learn from Saul that a man without God is a man without guts. That brings us then to transition. So this sets up the dilemma The writer has shown us kind of what's going on. He's shown us this battle, these two mountains, this valley, this challenger or this champion from the Philistines and his challenge against Israel. And we're seeing that nobody is willing to take it. And for over a month, this goes on, day after day after day. And then one day, everything changes when a man from Bethlehem, which was 12 miles, just 12 miles east of where this battle is taking place, is sent on a simple errand. David, the son of Jesse, is sent to the battlefront to bring his brothers essentially some bread and some cheese. It's a very simple errand. Apparently, Saul did not provide food for his troops, and so it was on the families to bring supplies for them. And so David, being the youngest brother, is asked, or rather told by his dad, to go and to bring his brothers some food. And so he does it. He wakes up early one morning. He finds somebody to watch his sheep. And then he goes out to the battle line. He goes out to Israel's camp. And as he's talking with his brothers, Goliath comes out and he takes his daily stand. He comes out and he says in verse 23, his usual rhetoric, his usual challenge that he's been making, he comes up and he speaks the same words as before. But this time it says David heard him. Now the reason that is significant is because David's about to react to this situation in a very different way from the way that everyone else had been reacting to this situation. So once everybody hears this challenge, all of the Israelites, the soldiers hear this, they essentially do what they've been doing. It says, when the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were much afraid. So 40 days have passed, but really nothing's changed. They're essentially just as scared, just as afraid as they were before. David, however, reacts to this very different. Instead of running away, David asks a question. Two questions, really, but really the most important question is the second. He says to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He's not just asking, hey, what's this guy's name? Who is this guy? He's saying, who does this guy think he is? Who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is to defy God's army? He's pointing out two things here. By calling attention to the fact that he was an uncircumcised Philistine, he's pointing out the fact that he doesn't have God. Because the covenant that God had made with Abraham, with all his descendants, was that this sign of circumcision was going to symbolize his relationship with them. And David's pointing out the fact that he doesn't have a relationship with God. He worships fake gods. He's a heathen. There's nothing that we should be afraid of. He says we belong to the armies of the living God. David is essentially looking at this in a completely different way than the rest of Israel. They're looking at Goliath, and all they can see is this 9-foot or 9.5-foot giant who's covered in armor. But David looks at him, and all he sees is an uncircumcised Philistine. He sees somebody that he knows he can beat, not because he thinks he can outmatch him or that he thinks that he's more skillful than Goliath, but simply because God was on their side and not on Goliath's. That's what David is asking and really implying with this question. He's essentially just kind of changing their perspective on this whole situation. However, this question or these questions that David was asking, it did not go over well, at least with one of his brothers. His oldest brother, Eliab, overhears these questions that David is asking. It says that his anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Now, I don't know if Eliab did not realize that Jesse had sent David or that he realized David was there to bring him food. I mean, David's doing him a favor, and he's, embarrassing him, belittling him in front of everybody. And then he's saying, you've just come to see the battle. And David's like, what battle? There's no fighting going on. For 40 days, you guys have just been standing around. But for some reason, Eliab is so upset over these questions that David is asking. And it may be because in the prior chapter, Eliab had been passed over. Whenever Samuel was sent to go to anoint the new king, Samuel thought it was going to be Eliab because Eliab was the oldest brother. And so he thought naturally God was going to select him. But of course, God said, the Lord has not chosen this one. And he says that over and over and over again until he has passed over all 7 of David's brothers. And then he gets to David and he says, this is the one. Anoint him. So it could be that Eliab is still stinging from that experience. But I think that more likely he is threatened by David's initiative. Because for 40 days, Eliab and his fellow soldiers have essentially just been standing around. They have lacked the initiative that his younger brother, who is much younger, by the way, there's 7 brothers between them, his younger brother is showing here. He just walks up and he's like, why isn't anybody confronting this guy? Why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And so, of course, I'm sure as an older brother or just as a soldier, that would be very embarrassing. And even it would be shameful to realize, why haven't we done anything about this? Now this young shepherd boy is kind of pointing out the obvious here. And what we learn from this, from his reaction here, is that opposition often comes from those who we least expect. Second to Goliath in this story, Eliab is the opponent that David has to deal with in this story. Before he faces off against Goliath, he's being confronted by his own brother. It's interesting to me that none of the other soldiers gave David any grief about his questions or about his inquiries. They answered him. Whenever he asked, what's going to be done for the man who kills this Philistine and who is this guy? They're happy to answer his questions. But then his very own brother is so upset with him for he having even asked these questions. And we see this in Jesus' life as well. Some of his biggest detractors were from his very own hometown of Nazareth. In fact, when Jesus was preaching there in Nazareth, his own people had tried to throw him off a cliff. And Jesus, even within his own family, had to face constant opposition, constant disbelief. It says in John 7, verse 5, that not even his brothers believed in him. In Mark 3:21, it says that when his family heard of what he was doing, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. And so we see with David, we see with Jesus, we see time and time again that opposition often comes from those whom we are closest to. And we have to be prepared for that. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. And so the only way that we are going to be able to overcome these detractors, this opposition that comes from within whenever it arises, is to make sure that we are looking to God and not to even the closest of friends, not even the closest of family members. It says in Micah 7, 5-7, put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. Jesus is alluding to this prophecy whenever he made his statements in Matthew 10. But notice what Micah says next. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. So David is showing us that we must be prepared to face opposition, even from those who we are closest to. And Eliab's reaction shows us that opposition often comes from those whom we least expect. So that was David's question. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Why is no one confronting him? God is on our side. He's not on his side. Why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And the more that David asks these questions and the more that he is speaking in this way, the more it starts to draw attention. I'm sure by this time, 40 days have passed. They're probably just deaf to Goliath's his challenge at this point. Nobody's taking it. Nobody's doing anything. And finally, somebody's come in who's showing some initiative, who's willing to actually ask some questions, who's willing to actually show some zeal. And so this is brought to Saul. They tell Saul that this young man is coming to the camp. He's asking questions. He's got interest. And so Saul, who is, of course, probably very desperate at this point, sends for David, and David is brought before him. And so David, if there was a time for him to maybe check himself and to maybe walk back some of his talk, now's the time for him to do it, because now he's in front of the king. And instead of walking it back, instead of him maybe, choosing to quiet down and to walk away, he doubles down on his confidence, and he tells Saul in verse 32, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." David's like, if no one's going to do it, I'll do it. If nobody's going to confront this guy, then I'll be the one to do it. And of course, Saul looks at him and he's like, weren't you the errand boy? Weren't you the one who just brought bread and cheese just a couple hours ago? What are you talking about? He's going to be skeptical of this because David is the least likely guy to raise his hand and say, I'll fight him. And so he says to him, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. He's saying, this guy's been killing people since before you were alive. What makes you think that you can fight him? What makes you think that you are qualified to act as Israel's champion? And notice what David said. David gives him his reasoning, and David's reasoning, you can tell, is very well thought out. He says in verse 34, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. David keeps bringing it back to God. David, for 40 days, from what we can tell, is the first man to bring God into this conversation. Over and over again, he's not just bringing up the fact that he's defied Israel, that he's put their king Saul to shame. He's pointing out the fact that God is being defied by this. God's people and God, by extension, have been defied and shamed by this Philistine. And so David is willing to go and defend his honor. And he's not acting on blind faith or impulse here. He has thought this through. He's looking back at past deliverance. He's looking at what God has done for him before, and he's saying that if God has delivered me before, he will deliver me again. He's not just appealing to his skill. He's not just appealing to the fact that, he's skillful in warfare. He's appealing to the fact that he has experienced divine deliverance. He has experienced the salvation of the Lord, and he trusts that the Lord will save him once more. And this is a portrait of true, unwavering faith. This is really just the mentality of a man who can, go through anything because he's not trusting in himself. He's not looking at the giant. He's looking to the God who will save him. David writes in Psalm 18:29, "For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall." And so David explains his reasons. He makes his appeal. And Saul, having heard this and probably having sensed the deep conviction in David, ultimately consents and allows him to go. He says to him, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And after this, Saul attempts to try to arm David in some armor. He tries to make up for maybe the difference in size between he and Goliath by trying to give him the right weapons, the right armor. And David ultimately decides, I can't fight in this. I haven't fought in this before. It's heavy. It's for one reason or another, David simply did not want to fight with it. And so he goes and he takes his staff so that he can navigate his way down that steep ravine. He takes his sling, and on his way down, he takes 5 smooth stones from that ravine or from that brook and puts them in his shepherd's pouch. And so this brings us then to the battle. This brings us to the climax that the entire story has been moving towards. And what we notice is this obvious incongruity, this disparity between these two champions. Normally you would try to match your champion to the champion that he's going against. And so if you got a 9-foot champion, you would try to find, all right, who's the tallest guy we got, and let's put him up against him. He's got the best shot. But David is outmatched by Goliath in every single way, from every angle. In terms of his size, David was probably under 6 feet tall, based upon the average height of a Jewish male at that time. Goliath, from what we can tell, was about 9.5 feet tall. He was outmatched in terms of his armor. Goliath is wearing probably 100 to 150 pounds of armor. Almost every square inch of his body is covered in this armor. And David is just wearing, presumably, what he wore to run the errand, his street clothes. And of course, there is the issue of experience. Goliath has been a seasoned warrior. He's probably fought these types of combats time and time again. This is not his first time fighting in this championship warfare, whereas David is basically just the champion who volunteered a few minutes ago. And so in terms of size, armor, and experience, David is clearly outmatched. But that is by design, and we will notice that more here at the end. But there's this obvious incongruity. There's this clear difference between these two champions, and Goliath notices it right away. It says in verse 42, when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And you know, Goliath is probably thinking, okay, you guys took 40 days to pick a guy, and this is the guy who you picked. This is probably the smallest, least likely person that Goliath has ever probably faced. And for 40 days, he's been challenging them and waiting on them. And then here comes David coming down, no armor, no experience, much smaller. And Goliath just mocks him. He curses him. And ultimately, he does consent to fight him. He tells David to come towards him, and he's essentially threatening him. He's trash talking. He tells him he'll give his flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. But clearly, Goliath just despises. He's insulted that he's even having to fight David here. He has no regard for him. He has utter contempt for him, and he just mercilessly mocks him, thinking that he is going to kill him within a matter of moments. But David, as he responds to this, rather than defending himself, rather than trying to defend his own experience or his own skill, instead uses it as an opportunity to glorify God. It says in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike. I guess I copied that twice. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And notice this, he says, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So David makes essentially this appeal to God, to the salvation of God, and he lays out very clearly that this is not David versus Goliath, this is God versus Goliath. And that is why David is so confident that he will triumph. And so now that they have exchanged words, the two champions approach one another, and the battle ensues. It says in verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and with the stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, that is Goliath's sword, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah arose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sherem as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And so the unexpected champion wins in the most unexpected of ways. Everything about this story, it defies our expectations. Even as David is approaching this Philistine, every odd is stacked against him. And even the likelihood of him striking Goliath on his forehead on his first try is probably 1 in 1,000. Because Goliath, every square inch of him was covered in armor except for his forehead. And yet that is the spot that David struck. And as the Israelites are watching this, you can only imagine how shocking, how there probably was just a few moments of silence before everyone realized and it registered what had just happened. But as soon as they realized that David had won the victory, the momentum immediately shifts over to Israel, and they advance finally against the Philistines, chase them out of their territory all the way into their own territory of Philistia. And so the story concludes with David having come on a simple errand, bringing some cheese and bread, and he leaves with Goliath's armor and his head. And so what is the lesson that we are to take from this story? Because as we read through David and Goliath, there are certainly many stories or many lessons that we can take. We looked at a few of them. We looked at, from Saul, we learned about the danger of trusting in yourself, the danger of severing yourself from God, and how that ultimately will come back to bite you in these moments of crisis. We looked at David and Eliab and how oftentimes we face opposition from our own friends, our own family, and how we have to be ready to handle that. But what is the overall lesson here? I've heard many sermons from this story about conquering your Goliath, so to speak. We had one of my favorite themes of the youth lectures in 2016 was, I think it was conquering giants, and we talked about this story and how it pertains to, especially with young people, all of the different issues that we are faced with, and how those giants are conquered. And there's definitely some really good application to be made there. But I think that those are secondary applications. I think those are extended applications that maybe once we zoom out and we start to extrapolate from the story and make application to our lives, that might be what we take from it. But I think that David lays out the lesson of this story very clearly. Just before he goes up to fight Goliath, he tells Goliath exactly what his victory is going to prove in verses 46 through 47. He says that this was going to occur, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. He's saying this is a demonstration. This is going to serve as a revelation of how God saves. And he's showing that God saves in the most unlikely of ways. God doesn't save us in the way that we think he's going to. He does not save with the sword, with the spear, with these things that we might otherwise put our trust in. You look at the David and Goliath story, and the Philistines had put their trust in Goliath. The Israelites had put their trust in Saul, and all of them were disappointed by that. Every single one of them ultimately was let down by the person that they had put their trust in. David comes along, he puts his trust in God, and the victory is won. And he's saying that is what his victory over Goliath proved, was that it was God who saved, and God chooses to save deliberately, by design, in the most unexpected, unlikely of ways. He's showing us that God is able to win through weakness. God does not have to fight with the biggest guy. In fact, God deliberately chooses to fight with the lesser things, the weaker things, so that he may be glorified. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:27 through 29, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. The irony of the David and Goliath story is that, David was selected to fight Goliath. The whole point of having this unlikely, unremarkable champion was so that God got all the glory, so that everybody looked at the story and said, wow, that was God. But a lot of times, I know I look at this story and I think, wow, look at David. I'm focused on what David did. But what really David is pointing us to is God. He's saying, I am not the hero here. David is certainly a hero of faith. He is certainly to be commended for his faith. But ultimately, it was God who triumphed. As we said before, it was God versus Goliath, not David versus Goliath. David was fully aware of the fact that he was acting as a vessel, that God was using him as the means through which he manifested and demonstrated this great lesson, that God wins through our weaknesses. And the reason that God chooses this sort of design, the reason God saves in this way, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:5, is so that our faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Again, he writes in 2 Corinthians that this is to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. These sort of stories, David and Goliath stories, even what we see with Jesus on the cross, that God sent his son and that he came not in the form of a physical king, not as Cody was talking about in the Lord's Supper, somebody who we looked at and we held in high esteem. He deliberately came in the form of a servant, of a carpenter from Nazareth, from a place that people look down on. Because God wanted to show that it's not about putting your trust in things and in prestige and power and people. It's about putting your faith in God and in God alone. That is why God operates in this way, so that God may get the glory. If Goliath won, the glory goes to Goliath. If Saul had accepted this challenge and fought and won, then the glory would go to Saul. But David won in order that the glory would go to God and to God alone. So the purpose of this story is to reorient our faith. It's to remind us to not put our trust in anything that is not God. The psalmist says in Psalm 146, verse 3, "Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man in whom there is no salvation." David writes in the 60th Psalm, Psalm 60, 11 through 12, he writes to God, "O God, grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. With God we shall do valiantly. It is he who will tread down our foes." That is what we are to take from the story of David and Goliath. If we put our trust in the wrong things, we will fail. We will be disappointed. But if we will put our trust in God, then the victory is ours. It is God who will tread down our foes. So that is the story of David and Goliath. There's far more that can be said. As I said, there's so much practical application to be made that we were not able to touch on this morning. But at the very least, we were able to draw out the central message, the central theme of this story. And I hope that you'll be able to take that with you throughout the rest of this week. At this time, we're going to be dismissed in a closing song, and we want to offer the opportunity for anybody who has not yet obeyed the gospel to do so. This time, we welcome you to come forward, confessing your belief in Jesus as the Son of God, to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. Whatever your need is, we just ask that you would come forward as we stand and sing. Thank you.